Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are thrilled to have Professor Steve Keen with us live from Bangkok. Our plan is to talk with Steve for about 45 minutes and then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for questions. After that, we will have a bonus presentation from Steve for those who would like to stay on. He'll be giving us a detailed explanation of how credit works in the economy using the dynamic model he's developed called Minsky. So if you're interested in that, you can stay on after our first hour. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. And we'll have Stuart choose the most popular ones. A little bit of housekeeping. This meeting's being recorded, so if you don't want your face recorded, please keep your video off. If everyone would also please stay on mute so that everyone can enjoy nice clear audio without echoes and interference, it would be appreciated. Thank you. Now, New Zealand, we're very fortunate to have eliminated COVID-19, but now we have to deal with the economic fallout. According to the OECD, New Zealand's heavy reliance on tourism will mean a bigger COVID-19 economic shock than most other countries. The government's response so far has been quantitative easing and conventional borrowing from banks and other financial institutions to provide some fiscal stimulus to the economy. Steve's going to tell us about the likely ramifications of this approach as opposed to using the government-owned reserve bank. He will also address the massive private debt time bomb. Our special guest is Professor Steve Keen. Steve is a distinguished research fellow of the University College of London and a Patreon crowd-funded economist. Welcome, Steve.
Good to be here. Thanks for the invite and congratulations to New Zealand, by the way.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, can you give us some background? Where does money come from?
Okay. Well, the easiest way to define money is it's what's in your bank accounts and what's in your pockets. Often we don't even get to the stage of having a decent definition of money. But fundamentally, that money can be created in two ways. Banks can lend out more than they get back in repayments, and governments can spend more than they take back in taxation. Those are the two fundamental ways that money are created. You're looking at a domestic economy. I'd add a third, which would cause me some angst with some supporters of modern monetary theory. But that is to say that a trade surplus can also run it. Equally, of course, banks repaying, more loans being repaid than issued, governments running a surplus, and a trade deficit all reduce the money supply. So if you want to increase the money supply, you've got to either get the banks to do it, which comes at the cost of the debt to the person who does the borrowing, or the government to do it by running a deficit. And we then get caught in all the hurly-burly about what that impact that deficit has on future generations, et cetera, which of course is the very topical conversation point right now.
And of course, that's not what most people think. That's not the way most people think money's created. How do most people think it's created?
I think most people think it's created by the government directly, giving like a welfare check to a dollar recipient who walks into a bank and hands it to the bank, and the bank then presses the buttons on its money multiplier model so that it hangs on to, say, $10 of the 100 deposited, loans out the other 90, and on you go. And that's a textbook model of money creation, which says the government is in control of the amount of money. And if you look at economic theory, conventional textbooks, you'll see they've got a vertical supply of money function in their drawings, and I'm not going to call them models, they're just drawings. Drawings of how the money supply is created. It's vertical because that implies the market has no impact on how money is created. So the government can move the amount of money up or down, and that then interacts with the demand for money to give you interest rate and so on. I've been part of a group of non-orthodox economists for about 60 years have been saying that's bollocks. And thankfully, the Bank of England in 2014 saved us from having to cite each other all the time and being ignored by the mainstream. When the Bank of England basically came out and said the rebels are right and the conventional textbooks are wrong, the government does not control the money supply. The government has one way of influencing it. I don't think the mainstream even understands that properly. I'm happy to talk about how deficits create money in a moment. And that's something, by the way, that I wasn't completely sure of myself until a few days ago when I modelled that in Minsky and saw that the way that it's presented by Stephanie Kelton in her book is quite accurate. Simply running a deficit creates money. But the main way the money is created is by banks lending out more than they get back in repayments. And again, the mainstream has a toy model of what banks do, what they call banks intermediaries. And if you ever read an economics textbook or an article by a conventional economist, you'll see the word intermediation throughout the article. Financial intermediaries, the banks intermediate, What that says is they assume that banks have money deposited by savers and they lend that money out to borrowers. And as a technical description of how banks function, that is completely wrong. But it's the mainstream way of doing it, and it then means fundamentally that banks in that model can't create money, whereas of course we know in the real world they can and do.
Yeah, that came as quite a shock to me when I first learned that. I think I first heard about that idea from one of your papers, the Rolling Cavaliers of Credit, way back when.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty ancient, but some great phrases from Marx and that. People think Marx didn't look at money, but he actually had quite a lot of interesting detailed work on the nature of money. And since I wrote that paper, I've developed, I mean, I wasn't the first person to argue it by any means. The earliest arguments you can find about bank money creation are made by people like, of all people, Arthur Pigou, back in the 1920s. Classical economists were fairly comfortable with the idea that banks created money, both in accepting that they did and understanding how. Irving Fisher did. So it's only the modern neoclassical economists, particularly the American brand, who've driven that realism into the backwater and thrust their mythical model into the foreground.
So it's not that we forgot, it's people deliberately suppressed it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in a sense, because if you conventional, one thing people will think economists are experts on is money. You know, if you're an economist, you must understand money. It's pretty much a casual person's interpretation of what an economist does. What they don't realise is that economists were experts at building models of the economy, which money and banks and debt did not even appear. And you can date that right back to Jean-Baptiste Say and even Smith to some extent. But they completely leave the banking sector out of their macro models. And one reason they do that, they're not particularly conscious of it, I think, but it's reality. When you include banks having the capacity to create money, there's no longer any sense of equilibrium in the economy. But they try to argue that capitalism reaches a welfare maximizing equilibrium, and that just disturbs the whole argument, so they don't even bother going there. And I see some outrageous howlers whenever you see mainstream economists trying to interpret monetary data. They make a complete fist of it because they simply don't understand what's going on, and they don't want to either.
So, well, that gives us a powerful other option if banks can create money. So how are we going to pay for COVID-19? There's a number of different ways to do it. That's one of them. What are the ways that people conventionally try to pay for it?
Well, the main thing they think you have to do is borrow money from the private sector, borrow money from the private banks. And this is, they're doing lots of that. But in fact, it's not creating any money at all. This is the weird thing. And it's why maybe I should switch over to showing my Minsky software for a while, Cliff. What do you think at the moment? Would that help?
Sure, we'll give it a try for a couple minutes, sure.
Okay, so hang on a second, I'll start screen, okay. So if you think about how people think about money, the people who think about it most clearly are accountants who invented the idea of double entry bookkeeping about 500 years ago. And they think in terms of assets, liabilities, and equity. And I was actually going to minimize this thing here so I just see you, Cliff, in the screen rather than everybody else. So this is my Minsky, a screenshot from my Minsky software. And what it does is it applies what's called the fundamental law of accounting, and that assets minus liability is equal to your equity. So if you think about your own financial situation, you're in positive equity, so your assets exceed your liabilities. If this sum applies, assets minus liabilities is equal to equity, and that's greater than zero. And that's a situation we'd all like to be in. The interesting thing is when you look at the world from the double entry bookkeeping point of view and apply it to macroeconomics, that's not possible. to everybody, because, as you know, one person's asset is another person's liability. Okay. If one person has assets greater than liability so that they have a positive equity, then with respect to the rest of the world, the opposite must apply. If you have a one-person sectoral division of the economy, one person versus everybody else, if that person's in positive equity of, say, $10, the rest of the world is in negative equity of precisely the same scale, minus $10. And that's what I call it, sort of a macro law of accounting. So what I've done here is apply that to a very simple model of financial flows. But I want to focus on the overall issue of what is money and how do you create it. And there we go. Okay. The simple way to look at it, money is the sum of the amount of money, the numbers in bank accounts and the bank equity side as well. I mean, ignoring cash just to make the argument simpler at this stage. So we had simply a pure electronic money system. Money would be the sum of bank deposits plus bank equity. So if you're going to create money, you have to increase the liabilities of the banking sector. Okay. Now, if you increase the liabilities, you also increase the assets. So you've got to have, to create money, you've got to increase the liabilities of the banking sector. And that requires that you also increase the assets. Now, if you look at a loan, and I've got the loan shown here, we've got a banking sector making loans to capitalists of $14.3 billion, let's say, then that increases the assets of the banking sector by 14.3, and it increases the liabilities by 14.3. So that's one way to create money. The other is, if the government spends money on firms, it increases bank reserves and it increases the bank account of the firms as well. That also creates money. So those are two operations that create money. And when we talk about selling bonds to the private banking sector and using that to finance things like COVID recovery and so on, how do banks get the money to buy the bonds in the first place? How do they make it? Well, they don't make it. It's actually, they use their reserves. So for a bank, when a bank buys bonds off the government, it's got money in reserves that's earning no interest. It's given the offer of buying bonds instead, which will have an interest rate, and they simply do an asset swap. And if you look at it in terms of selling bonds to banks here, so I've got the government it's selling bonds to the banking sector, which means the money value of bonds goes up for the banks. The money value of the assets that the reserves they have goes down. There's no money creation. And that's fundamentally what QE is about. It's an asset swap. And the same thing for if you try to sell COVID bonds to raise money, you wouldn't be raising money. You'd simply be reallocating money that already existed, which was largely created by the government running a deficit.
Okay, so can we go through that in some more detail in part two?
Yep.
So so if we're running through the different options to pay for COVID-19, one of them is to borrow money from banks, like the government's currently doing, or our government is, and I think most governments around the world are doing. New Zealand's in a relatively good position to borrow, says our government. We're only at 20% of GDP is our national debt, and it's only going to go up to 53% of GDP. That's okay, isn't it?
Well, this is the thing that again, we need to have an integrated look at how the financial sector operates. And this is something which most commentators don't have. They will talk about how bad it is for the government to be in debt. And this is a terrible burden on our children in the future. But I want to go back to that assets minus liabilities equals equity. If you think about that for each individual, what applies at the individual level applies at the group level as well. If you're in positive equity, the rest of the world is negative equity with respect to you. Okay? The sum of all equity is zero. Now, where do we start from? If we have a private banking system, which of course we have, to be a bank must have positive equity. Okay? Any bank which has negative equity, where its liabilities are greater than its assets, is technically bankrupt. So banks can be transitorily in that case, but the banking sector in general has to be in positive equity. Therefore, the non-bank sector, and you think about the world in terms of a world with just pure credit right now, no government at all. In the rest of the world, there has to be a negative equity with respect to the banks. So we might do our sums individually, and some of us will be in positive equity, others in negative, but overall the non-bank sector has to be in negative equity, which is precisely equal to the positive equity of the banking sector.
And that's private debt? That's
private debt. So the money, when you have a credit system, is entirely created by private debt. So you have banks issuing private debt. Here's $1 million to buy a house in Auckland. And by the way, you owe us $1 million. Okay. So that's a double. So they create money and they create debt for the person who receives the money. Now, one thing we'll get caught up in doing, and this is classically what's happened in New Zealand as well, is that nobody likes being in negative equity, even though it's actually structurally impossible to avoid. None of us like it. So what do? We tend to go and borrow money from banks and gamble on rising asset prices. And that's what actually causes the rising asset prices. And I can show that correlation later when we start talking about the empirical stuff. So we end up with this fictional calculation that all of us have got in our minds to some extent, where as well as valuing the strict money we have in our bank accounts and so on, which money is stuff you can spend instantly. Okay. You can't spend your house. You've got to sell your house before you can raise the money that you then spend from the proceeds. But we make this calculation of the price the last asset sold for, multiplied by how many of those assets I've got. That's my net worth, or part of my net worth. And if there's a house price bubble going on, you're going to get an enormous valuation. And everybody who's got housing debt can make the same calculation. Yes, I might owe $1 million to the bank, but my house is worth $2 million. So therefore, I've got a $1 million positive equity out of that particular transaction. Overall, I'm positive equity. If we all tried to sell our houses at the same time, I think that price might fall a bit. So it's a fictional calculation, but it satisfies us to make us think we're okay. But in fact, the true reality is that when you do the proper sums, the sum of all equity is zero. The banking sector must be in positive equity. The rest of the economy, and I can now talk about including the government, must be in negative equity. Now, as I said, none of us like being in negative equity. The question is who can sustain it? Okay. Well, firms can sustain being in negative equity if the turnover they're getting out of their money is such that they can service the interest on their debt. Okay. Households can do a similar thing, but households don't sell the children. You might consider it sometimes, but you don't make profit out of the kids. So the negative equity is harder for the household sector to sustain, and that's where a lot of the pressure for speculation comes from. But if you think about the government, you've got two choices in the non-bank sector as to who can sustain negative equity. The private, let's say three, private corporations, households, or the government. Okay. Now, firms often manage to function that way because they've got the turnover of money, they're making profit sufficient to cover their debt repayments, even though their debt might be worth more than would be worth more than their financial assets are worth. The households were the ones who go and borrow money, and in fact, they get more negative equity as they borrow that money. What about the government? Well, if the government borrows money, who does it borrow from? It borrows from the central bank. Who owns the central bank? The government. So you look at the sums and you work out that it's actually the institution that can most easily cope with negative equity is in fact the Treasury. And I can show a simulation of this if that would be helpful. I've done a model now of a combined credit and fiat money economy. When you look at the sums...
Part two, that would be good. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just try and bring that up. Hang on a second.
Well, can you hold that off, Steve, until part two?
Yeah, sure, I can do that later. Yep.
Yeah. So to pay for COVID, we can do conventional borrowing from banks, but is it necessary?
No, it's not necessary at all. And this is one of again, what's really important to think in terms of assets and liabilities. And for a start, I was not clear on that question myself literally a week ago, because I've decided I'd finally build a model of some of the assertions of modern monetary theory. The monetary ones, not the job guarantee and not the international trade stuff, just the monetary. What is the accounting behind their claims? And if I had two mental pictures, and I think a lot of people here might have similar ones to me before I actually did this modelling, I thought that the government deficit only created money to the extent to which the central bank purchased bonds that we issued to finance the deficit. So you imagine the government spending, say, I'll use round figures, 100 billion and taxing 90, therefore having a deficit of 10 billion. I thought if the central bank purchased 1 billion of those bonds through open market operations, then that created 1 billion worth of money. In fact, turns out I was wrong. One of the claims in Stephanie Kelton's book is quite accurate, and that is that the money creation is equal to the deficit. If the government runs a deficit of 10 billion, it creates $10 billion of additional money. What the central bank purchases of bonds off the private banking sector, and the private banking sector's own purchase of bonds from government in the initial offerings that the government makes of Treasury bonds, all that does is shuffle around the money that's already been created by the deficit. So the whole idea that the central bank funds the government is true in one sense, and that is the government needs a loan. The government has to be able to have a negative balance in its Treasury account, or it has to take on debt from the central bank to keep its Treasury level at zero. So fundamentally, the central bank doing that initial financing of the deficit, that's what enables the money to be created. But the sale of bonds to the private banking sector is simply a swap of one asset, which is bank reserves, that doesn't earn any interest for the banks, for another, which is Treasury bonds that does earn interest. And that's one reason why you've never had an issuance of bonds anywhere in the world which hasn't been oversubscribed, because in effect, the banking sector is being said, you want some free money. And the free money they're getting is, you've got reserves which are paying you zero interest. Let's say there's $10 billion in reserves, and you've got an offer of, they're giving the $10 billion example for a deficit. We're creating $10 billion worth of reserves, which is money we're going to put into people's bank accounts. That's going to be dole payments and buying goods and services off the firm sector, and and pensions and so on and so forth. We're putting that money in people's bank accounts, which are the liabilities of the banking sector. That necessarily comes in through the assets of the banking sector. So that 10 billion turns up in the reserves of the banks. Then it's sitting there, and because the law requires, governments have passed laws requiring themselves to finance deficits by bond issues, the Treasury then issues $10 billion worth of bonds. Now, the banking sector is sitting there with $10 billion in cash, earning zero interest and no bonds. And the government says, we're going to issue $10 billion worth of bonds. Oh, okay, we're going to buy that 10 billion, because we go from something which is 10 billion earning zero interest, let's say, to 10 billion earning 2%. And therefore we get, 200 million, 20 million. I'm not going to do the round figures in my head while I'm talking at the same time. But it's money for nothing, fundamentally, for the banking sector. So that's why they subscribe to it. Yeah, and that's why it isn't. Where does the money come from? The money is actually created by the deficit in the first place. So the whole idea you need to get the money from somebody else is simply wrong, and you can see it when you think in terms of assets, liabilities, and equity.
We got one political party that thinks what we should do to pay for COVID is increase taxes. What do you think of that idea in a recession?
Yeah, well, the taxes, again, think in terms of assets and liabilities. If government is increases taxes, it's taking more money out of the private sector. So the money comes out of private bank accounts. So you have a decline in the amount of money in the economy. Now, what that's going to cause is a decline in economic activity. And what are you trying to do? You're trying to boost economic activity. So this is again one of the errors we do, in which we think about these things from an individual perspective, not thinking about the overall system. And we apply what applies to us as individuals to the system when that doesn't actually function. So the assets, liabilities, and equity stuff, that does transcribe from the individual scale to the social scale. But if you think about saving money, as an individual, you can spend less than you earn. You can decide to have a gap between your income and your expenditure, and that will increase your bank account, which you call savings. Okay. Now, at the national level, or the integrated economic level, what you spend becomes income for somebody else. So if I bought the background off Cliff, I know it's a Zoom background, but if I bought your background painting off you, that would be a transfer of money from me to you. It's an expenditure for me, it's an income for you. So at the national level, income is identical to expenditure. Now, if you therefore try to save at the national level, what you do is reduce expenditure on other people at the national level. There is no such thing as aggregate savings. Again, this is something which is weird for most people to get their heads around. But when you try to save at the individual level, you can. When you try to save at the collective level, you can't. What you do is reduce expenditure, and expenditure is income.
That's not good when you're in a recession, I assume.
Yeah, it's going to make it worse. It'll reduce GDP. The impact of trying to do that will be reduced GDP.
What
now,
about
what
austerity? We got other parties saying, there's a couple of parties, we've got political parties saying, let's cut government spending. So we can pay down our debt. What do you think of that one?
That cuts income as well. Yeah. Again, even with a simple definition of the GDP in textbooks, you get GDP is its consumption plus investment plus government spending minus taxation plus exports minus imports. Now, if you cut G or increase T, you reduce GDP. And what's going on here is a mistake of thinking about the level of debt when you're actually concerned about the ratio of debt to income. So if you think about, and this is a simple analogy, if you imagine having an economy where there's $300 billion worth of money in the economy and it turns over twice a year, you'll have a GDP of $600 billion. And then you decide to run a 1% of GDP surplus to try to reduce that debt level. That's $6 billion. Your debt level, let's say your debt's 100% of GDP. By using that to pay your debt down, you'll go from 600 billion to 594 billion, but your GDP will fall by 6 billion as well. Okay, so your ratio remains constant. Then you've also got less money turning over in the economy, even if it turns over at the same rate, turns over twice a year. As well as taking 6 billion out directly, you'll take out another 12 billion in overall demand. So your attempt to reduce your debt ratio reduces GDP by more than it reduces debt, and the ratio can rise.
It's fruitless.
So it's simplistic half-wake thinking which leads to all these proposals about tax increases to pay for COVID or austerity.
So what's our best method of paying for COVID-19 then, in your opinion?
Running a deficit. The government should run a deficit, and it can do that. Again, this is where the monetary claims of MMT make sense. The constraints on government spending aren't the availability of money, because quite literally, running a government deficit creates money. So you don't need to worry about where's the money going to come from. You create it by running a deficit in a similar fashion to the way that banks create money by lending out more than they get back in repayments. Because you increase the assets of the banking sector, you therefore increase the liabilities, and the sum of liabilities plus equity of the banking sector is the money supply. So you can create the money that way. And the government can sustain that deficit indefinitely because you can audit the central bank and find that it's got zero equity, quite possibly. Nobody audits the Treasury, but the Treasury is actually the one carrying negative equity. And the negative equity the Treasury has will be precisely equal to the positive equity of the non-government sector. That includes the banks in that arrangement as well. So if you want to have a private non-bank sector with positive equity, you need the government to run a deficit. And then in general, of course, at the moment, given the fact there's going to be a collapse in private demand, you need the government to provide that boost in the meantime. So the government should run the deficit. The constraints are then, are you going to have inflation? Well, not with the level of private debt you've got, and not with the collapse in the tourist trade. So you may well have some substantial fall in real income as well, because you've got the capacity to produce stuff that's no longer being consumed, such as trips to the Bay of Islands and so on. And milk, I imagine your exports of all those sorts of things are going to decline. So you can't necessarily avoid a real decline in living standards, but there's no monetary problem about it.
Well, talking about running deficits, people would generally think that's a bad idea. So, but why is it a bad idea to run, why shouldn't we run a surplus? The government. Why shouldn't the government run a surplus?
Well, if the government runs a surplus, it takes money out of your accounts. And again, I can show that with my Minsky software, which I might it may be worth bringing up now just to make that point. It's stuff which I'll probably get more of a chance to talk through the system with people to stay for the subsequent unit. But what I do, and I'll just actually bring it up on my screen before I start. It's going to look, it may look scary to people. You know, they tell me if you think it looks scary. Okay. This is my Minsky software.
It looks scary.
I just reduced a bug just then that I've been trying to show to my programmers. So if you actually just send me a copy of that recording, Phil, take account of the time that's a bug that I'm resizing and I'm trying to move elements of the model. But what this does is look at the economy from the point of view of a bank, and then of firms in the economy, the people who own the firms, capitalists, the workers who work there, etc., etc. And what I have is the bank having three sorts of assets: loans to capitalists. So I've got this simple little world where only capitalists are allowed to borrow money. Bonds owned by the banking sector. Oh, sorry. No, that's deposits of the banks at the central bank. BD. I'm calling it BD rather than BR for bank reserves. And bonds, treasury bonds that they own. And the way you create more money is by loans being greater than repayments, or spending on firms being greater than taxing on firms. That increases the asset side, so it increases the liability side. Now, down here I've got, this is the operation of the government in the final 4 lines here. So there's taxing firms, spending on firms, selling bonds to the banks to finance the deficit. So the difference between spending and taxation tells how many bonds are offered to be sold to the banking sector, and that determines the bonds there. And then you have to pay interest on the bonds to the banking sector. So the operations that actually create money are the ones that increase assets and liabilities, and that's lending greater than repayments, spending greater than taxation, and interest. Those are the things that create money. Selling the bonds themselves doesn't create money. Now, when I go through the overall logic of the model, look what happens with the central bank. These are all the operations between the Treasury deposit account and the bank reserves. The important one is what's happening to the Treasury. And I'll just bring that up again. I know I'm doing this too quickly and something I should be giving a lecture course on rather than just a few minutes here. But if you look at taxing increases the equity of the Treasury. Spending reduces the equity of the Treasury. Selling bonds to banks increases the assets, which is the Treasury deposits, and increases the liability, which are the bonds that the banking sector now owns that the Treasury has to pay interest on. Paying interest reduces the equity of the Treasury. Paying interest to the central bank also does the same thing, and then the central bank pays dividends to the Treasury as well. Now I'll just simulate this with a level of government spending of 2% of GDP, which is roughly the level that America has run a deficit at for the last 120 years. And if I just show the values that are turning up here, what you get is the Treasury ends up in negative equity. I'll just pause the simulation at that point. So I've got Treasury equity of minus 83.5. If I come down here and take a look at the overall equity calculations that I can do in the model, I find the non-government equity is 83.5, the mirror image of the negative equity of the government. So that's government running a deficit. Now, if the government decides that that's terrible, look at all the negative equity we have, which is the blue line coming down here. They don't look at the green line. They don't consider what the equity of the non-bank, the non-government sector is. And our debt ratio is rising. The red line there is the debt ratio of the government. The black line is the private sector's debt ratio, which is falling as the government debt level rises. But then they decide, well, we need to reduce this terrible deficit we're running out for our children in the future. So they increase taxation. Pardon me, I've managed to reset taxation rather than starting. I'll start with the the deficit first of all. And what you find is a rising government debt level and a falling private debt level. Rising private equity and falling government equity, one being the opposite sign of the other. And then if the government decides to increase taxes to compensate, watch what happens to the green line and the blue line in this chart down here. Now the deficit goes to a surplus, the government's debt level falls, but the private sector debt level is rising, and the private sector has been driven towards negative equity again. So what tends to happen is people go and borrow money from banks. And then you can get an increasing amount of money in the economy, and it can look like it's booming, like for example the 1920s. But that boom will only continue as long as people continue borrowing and gambling, borrowing from banks and gambling on that money on asset prices. If you get the sort of syndrome of the Great Depression where people think they've got too much debt and they stop doing it, then you have a crash in the economy. So I know this is very complicated and I've done it far too quickly, but this is the sort of integrated view you need to have. And the most important part of it, and I'll bring this back up and zoom in a bit here, if the government tries to achieve positive equity, it drives the private sector into negative equity. And what the government should be worried about is trying to achieve positive equity for its citizens. It does that by having negative equity for itself. When I look at this,
a good time to discuss the private debt issues and what we call the private debt time bomb. So what's the big deal, Steve, with private debt?
Well, it's because the real deal for private debt is we, unlike the government, we don't own our own bank. So if we reach a situation where we can't repay what we owe to the banks, we are bankrupt. We do shut down. We can run out of money. And when you look at the discussion, I find it ridiculous whenever I graph this, because you might think the red line's public debt. No, the red line's private debt. That's New Zealand's private versus public debt situation. So with all the focus on the blue line, this is what's been happening to the red line. Okay, if you go back to the days of Rogernomics, you had a debt level of well under 50% of GDP. You've gone from that to 200% of GDP, and then a decline since the Great Recession, since the global financial crisis. A rise in government debt. Notice how much this looks a bit like the chart I was showing you in my simulation software beforehand. So you worry about government debt and ignore private. Why do you ignore private? Because your economic theory tells you private debt doesn't matter. Is your theory right? No. Okay. You also worry about public deficits and ignore private. Now the red line is the annual change in private debt, which has been as high as virtually 1/3 of GDP, certainly about 1/4 of GDP per year. At various times when the economy appeared to be booming and the government was running a deficit, running a surplus, pardon me, very proud of itself. Then you have a collapse in private sector expenditure, much less borrowing, and the private sector starts to pay its debt level down. The government rises because of it. So an attempt to control this will actually drive that crazy. And can I go into the housing issue as well, Cliff?
Yes, please.
Okay, okay. I saw the reply you got from the Reserve Bank saying that this is the statement they actually made, that the petition argues that the monetary system has been a key driver of high house prices. And they say, I'm sorry, the claim is not supported. Well, I think you can see a bit of a relationship between debt and house prices there. I want to go for the causal argument. And fundamentally, no, you don't buy a house with cash. The vast majority of purchases, you borrow money to buy the house. So if you want to see how many, what's the annual demand for housing in terms of the average house terms, you would divide new mortgages by the price level. And that's how many standard houses can be purchased at any particular point in time. Differentiate that with respect to time. I'm being a bit mathematical here, but you go from the new mortgages divided by the price level, tells you how many can be purchased. To have rising demand, you have to have change in new mortgages causing change in the price level. So you get a relationship between change in new mortgages, or change in new household debt, which I call change in credit, household credit, and change in house prices. So using that data, I differentiate, get the rate of change of, with respect to time with the house index, and get the second differential of this. This is the level of debt. The annual change in debt is credit, and I'm looking at the change in credit. Now, when I do that, this is the relationship I get for New Zealand. And rather than no relationship, that's a correlation coefficient of 0.8. So that's saying, you know, at least 65% of what you see in terms of house price variation can be explained by variations in the level of mortgage debt.
So is the Reserve Bank right to tell us that?
Totally wrong. I didn't have a bloody clue, and this is typical.
So changes in credit do cause house prices to increase.
Yeah, and I haven't done the work myself, but I work with a colleague in America and haven't had a chance to publish. There's too much, you know, there's the old fridge stickers. So, you know, for me, there's so many mistakes in neoclassical economics, so little time to take them all on. We did what's called range of causality analysis between these two trends in the American data. And it's a very weak way of working out causality, but it tells you what are the odds X causes Y or Y causes X. And the odds that X cause Y, where X is new mortgages and Y is the price level, was 15 times the reverse.
Oh, really?
Okay, so I can make a causal argument as well as a correlation argument here. Change in new mortgages drives change in house prices. And if you control the house price, control mortgage debt, you'll control house price rises.
Wow.
Okay.
There's another comment that the Reserve Bank made, and just to fill in the audience a little bit, Positive Money New Zealand made a petition to the Reserve Bank suggesting that we adopt sovereign money where the private banks don't create any money at all, and the Reserve Bank creates all the money for the economy. And the comment that Steve just put up on the screen was one of the comments they made. The other comment they made was that having the government create money, the Reserve Bank create money, would lead to inflation. And this is a very common argument whenever this is proposed. What do you think about that argument? Is that true, or?
Not particularly. I mean, when you look at periods of inflation, they tend to be periods where you have an enormous economic pressure in the economy from high levels of employment, the boom levels we had around the world in the 1960s and 1970s meant massive increases in prices for oil, markups being put through by oil producers. They were being screwed for the previous 50 years. They got even in 1973 by quadrupling oil prices from $2.50 a barrel to 10, and then they returned the favour again in 79. It went from $10 a barrel to 40. That was the level of economic activity causing the change in the money supply, not vice versa. It's the political power that groups will have at various times to demand more of a share of what's being produced that the monetary system then accommodates, rather than the monetary system itself causing the boost in prices. So again, they've got the causation the wrong way around. They think changing the money supply will change the prices. This is again the work that gave rise to endogenous money theory in the 70s, done particularly by Basil Moore. He looked at the causation and again found that causation went from wage demands by workers and margin demands by corporations and raw material price demands by particularly oil producers. They preceded the change in the money supply, which then was accommodative of those pressures. So it struggles over income distribution to give you inflation, in so many words, not changes in the money supply.
So in your opinion then, can we have the Reserve Bank create money and provide it directly to the government and set it up so that it doesn't cause inflation in our economy?
Yeah, you can. I mean, again, if you look at what I have in this, I'll bring that model back up again. Again, I apologise for the fact that I'll go to another version which is rather more English language like, if I can find that before I go across to...
Just a reminder to people, if you got questions, put them in the chat because we're about to switch to questions soon.
sharing the screen once more. Okay. This is a skeleton of a view of the economy, looking at it from the point of view of 5 different sectors. You'll notice that overall, they're looking at the central bank situation. When the central bank is involved in the bond sales by the Treasury, or purchases bonds off banks, or the spending by the government, or interest, etc., nothing at all happens to its equity. Its equity is unaffected. All the action for the equity comes over here on the Treasury side. So if the government spends more than it gets back in taxation and pays interest on bonds, it'll go into negative equity. And that negative equity then comes back over here to give the banking sector positive equity through interest it's paying on bonds. And as I'm showing this in terms of the firm sector being the recipient of government spending, the firm sector getting additional positive equity because the government is spending more on it than it's taxing. So the positive equity, the negative equity, the Treasury will cause the positive equity over here. All you have to do is run a deficit. And then rather than selling bonds, you can have the central bank, which I'm showing over here, making loans to the Treasury. So this idea of the bonds being sold here, you could replace the bond sales to the private banking sector by direct lending by the central bank to the Treasury and have the same impact.
That's basically your recommendation, isn't it?
Yeah, or you just do open market operations where you could, if you wanted to pretend, if you wanted to fool the financial sector into thinking that it wasn't happening, then you could still sell the bonds as always, because by running a deficit, which is happening up here, you create the money that then they willingly change from reserves to bonds because they get a positive return on bonds and no return on the reserves. And then the central bank can buy the bonds back off them again, which means you'll end up paying no interest on the bonds to the banking sector. That's the overall impact of selling the bonds and then the central bank buying them through open market operations.
Okay. Well, can we open it up to some questions? But our first question here, someone sent in previously, there's a debate between advocates for gold-based money and those for fiat money. My understanding is that there's no problem with fiat money itself. It's the debt attachment to fiat money that's the problem. Is that accurate?
What's the problem again?
Is that there's no problem with fiat money itself. It's the debt attachment to fiat money.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you can have too much private credit. You need a certain amount of private credit or a certain amount of private debt because we can't afford to buy large items like automobiles or houses, and firms can't afford to finance all the investment they want to do out of equity initially. So there's a couple of legitimate reasons to borrow money to do that. But the banking sector makes money by creating debt. So they have a positive encouragement to create as much debt as they can get away with. And I highly recommend reading Richard Vague's beautiful little book, A Brief History of Doom, because he's an ex-banker, a very successful banker. And he then became a critic of the level of private debt and has now he's commissioned a brilliant study into the major financial crises of the last 1.5 centuries around the world, finding roughly 150 over the last 1.5 centuries in different countries, obviously. And the book goes through the 6 major ones. And speaking as a banker, he said, look, banks will sell as much debt as they can possibly manage because their fees are based on how much debt they create. So you don't let the private banks decide how much is created because they'll create too much. And you don't let them decide completely where it goes to because they'll all go to the same fad. He actually I'm sure he's a billionaire, he won't tell me, but I'm sure he is. He made his first fortune when he was managing the consumer wing of a Texan bank, where, like all other Texan banks, it had lent a bomb to oil rigs in the early 1980s, and then the price of oil collapsed from $40 to $10 a barrel, and they all went bankrupt, and they sold off what was profitable divisions. He bought the consumer wing and turned it into a very successful credit card company. So he knows how bankers behave and says you do not let them decide how much debt is created. They'll create too much, they'll create it in the wrong sectors, and they'll all fad around what's the current popular section to sell into. You do have to have social controls on how much debt banks create and where they allocate it. And again, the idea that you shouldn't is just not recognising that being a bank is a privilege. It's a social privilege granted by the state, having a capacity to create money.
Now here's the next one. Please explain whether government debt has to be repaid. If so, how and to whom?
No, it doesn't have to be repaid.
If not, why not, it says.
Well, if you repay government debt, what you do is reduce the government's negative equity. When you reduce that negative equity, you decrease the positive equity of the non-government sector. So you're on a seesaw, okay? Everybody thinks that government's got this huge amount of debt and that's really bad. But you're on a seesaw. If one side goes positive equity, the other necessarily goes to negative. Now, so it's no longer a case of should the government have no debt. It's should the government's equity position be positive or negative, and if it's positive, you're negative and vice versa, okay? So what's the best angle for the economy? Is it zero? No, if it's zero, the problem there is there's another seesaw we're also all on, which is the banking sector seesaw. Now the banking sector is in positive equity and the non-bankers are negative. Now is that sustainable? Well, look at the 1920s, okay? When we find ourselves in negative equity or push that way, we go and borrow money from banks and gamble and think we can do that to the seesaw. And we only do that for the seesaw because we're driven up asset prices. What's driven up asset prices? This side has. Finally, it all comes crashing down in the 1930s. So an integrated view says that it's better for the government to be in negative equity, and the government's negative equity will be dollar for dollar, precisely equal to the positive equity of the non-government sector. And then with that balance, you say, well, that's the best situation. The question not is whether the government should be in negative equity, but how much negative equity makes sense.
That's the part that needs to be looked at accurately or predicted. Our next question, is it accurate to say that the state central banks of most nations have become only brokers of loans from external sources rather than public money creators themselves?
No, it's not true.
No.
That's right. Rather, pass me again. Okay.
Is it accurate to say that the state central banks of most nations have become only brokers of loans from external sources rather than public money creators themselves?
No. Well, for a start, they're not public money creators. Again, this is something which I'm only beginning to understand by building general models of a mixed fiat monetary economy, a fiat credit economy in Minsky. But if you take a look at the central bank, it's not the one that carries the negative equity, which is what creates the money in the private sector. It's the Treasury that does. It needs the central bank as a mechanism for doing that, but the essential part of the Treasury must run a deficit before there's money creation. So if the government's trying not to run a deficit, it's really the government that's not creating sufficient money. And then what happens is we go across to private banks to create the money we want. We need that expanding money supply when you have an expanding capitalist economy. So we get it out of borrowed money and then we get caught in the asset bubbles, which have characterized the last 30 years. So it's more a case of not understanding the monetary dynamics. And I'm quite happy to say that economists don't understand monetary dynamics, particularly most of those in central banks. And then precipitating too much fiat money, of credit money creation by abrogating the government's responsibilities on fiat money.
Should the New Zealand economy, which has recently been carried by the expansion of private household debt from a positive immigration rate, be worried about a reduction in immigration from COVID?
That's a good point. I think you're going to get lots of people trying to migrate to New Zealand because of COVID, by the way.
It's already happening.
I'm speaking from Thailand, and I'm in Thailand because my partner is Thai. She hadn't lived here for 25 years. But when I saw what was happening with COVID, where we were, which was Amsterdam, where I did live, which was the UK, I said, I want the fuck out of Europe. And we got here one day before they shut the border to tourists. I'm now trying to manage to get my own situation changed so that I can stay as a permanent resident of Thailand. You're likely to face a similar crisis. I know people who are themselves looking at getting out of America, and they're looking at, so you're going to get COVID migration, and you may have to, it won't be large initially, but you might find yourself with a lot of refugees from COVID part. You're going to have to work out some way to manage that.
So it's just the opposite. We shouldn't be
Yeah.
worried about a reduction. We should be worried about an increase.
Yeah, I think initially, obviously, a reduction, but over time, a substantial increase is likely.
Okay. Got time for a couple more, I think, here. Let's see. In 1999, here in New Zealand, the land portion of property was removed from the Consumer Price Index. Did this essentially remove the alarm bells from the interest rate inflation targeting regime, allowing foreign banks to provide credit beyond any real fundamental basis?
I think that's fairly valid. Yeah, I mean, the Consumer Price Index is a very vexed part of how we think about monetary dynamics in general. Are we having inflation or we're not having inflation? You've got complicated indices being used, but taking out, not including assets in the price of consumer goods is partially a sensible thing. But when a large part of the money supply is used to buy assets, then it clouds how well we can understand what the hell's going on, not to have a reliable index for that impact. I would rather have asset price indices and, I'm having alarm bells ringing when asset prices are rising too quickly.
Maybe have another index that's for asset prices.
Yeah, well, we already have it. We think it's a good thing when it increases. Of course, it's not. What it's actually indicating is that precisely the dynamics I showed a while ago, you're allowing too much money creation to drive up asset prices, and it's ultimately unsustainable. That's far more the unsustainable issue than government debt.
Here's one. I would love to hear Steve's analysis of Japan's move to quantitative easing, or QQE, money-based targeting, rather than conventional external debt-funded QE that they have implemented since 2013. What's your opinion of what Japan?
Well, I can't say I've analysed it carefully enough, so I'm not going to answer the question. Okay. I mean, Japan has shown, by the way, that there's no such thing as an unsustainable government deficit if you are running a trade surplus, because they've gone from, I mean, the Japanese data is quite fascinating. I can rapidly show that if you just give me a moment to do that. I convert all my New Zealand's to Japan's in the charts that I have here, and I think most of them are likely to fit on the scales that I've chosen. So I'll just do that. Okay, and then go back and let's take a look at the data. Once I've got it running, I'll show it here. So let's go and share the screen again. So I hope you can see that chart. The red line is, again, it looks a bit like your situation in some ways. Everybody's worried about the level of government debt. Then from the 9th, I'll just bring the dates up here, from 1987 on, government debt fallen from 63% to 55% of GDP, and Japan's proud of itself, ignoring the fact that private debt's gone from 140% of GDP in 1980 to 220% pretty much in the mid-1990s, and certainly when the crisis occurred, 200% of GDP. And then you've had this decline in private debt with a non-stop rise in government debt. Now, it's gone from government debt of 55% of GDP to government debt of 220% of GDP. And last time I checked, they haven't got an inflation problem.
No.
And the other stuff, if I can actually, these are all, something's wrong with my price index for Japan, unfortunately, so I can't show that data. But again, the same story applies. They had a housing bubble driven by too much mortgage debt. Okay.
Here's, has Steve had any contact with New Zealand Treasury or the Reserve Bank since 2012? When you made a proposal to develop Minsky with them?
No, I had a positive contact from the upper echelons of the bank, and then I was sabotaged by the neoclassical economists in the bank, particularly a newly arrived Scottish person. Who I just discounted because he'd only been there 3 weeks, but the guy was such a rabid believer in the neoclassical mainstream. He rallied the troops to drive me out. So what was an initial positive feeler from the Treasury chief executive, which could have led to developing quite a sophisticated model of the New Zealand economy using non-equilibrium monetary dynamics, which is what I work on, totally went down the tube, and you got neoclassicals instead. So the extent to which they defend themselves like a religion is quite remarkable.
All right, last question. How can central banks raise interest rates given the levels of private debt, or is it unlikely they will?
I think it's unlikely they will, because partly, and again, when I put a general model together, my model of financial instability, what I find is treating the bank interest rate as a markup on the inflation rate. You have a tendency towards deflation coming out of rising debt levels. And that the deflation occurs largely because you're reducing the bargaining power of workers. And over time, the share going to workers falls and the amount going to bankers increases. And capitalists sit in the middle, getting much the same overall share until the workers can't reduce their wages fast enough to keep up with the compounding, balancing the compounding of debt on the other side, and you have a collapse coming out of it. Those are the overall dynamics. So deflation is the likely outcome of too much private debt. That's what happened back in the 1930s. It's what's happening again now. So if you put interest rates up, you'd cause a rapid increase in bankruptcies. And that would, first of all, rapidly be reversed, but also, they don't have any freedom anymore. Their capacity to push the base rate is completely constrained by the level of private debt that now exists and the fragility of the non-bank private sector.
Good. Well, thanks, Steve. That's the end of our first hour. For those who want to stay on now, we're going to be going in and discussing a little more mathematical analysis using Steve's Minsky model. But thanks for your questions. If you're leaving us now, thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll talk to you again another time. If we get a little bit of time, we'll see if we can address some more of the questions at the end, Steve. There is quite a pile of them, but just want to give people the chance to move on if they need to do something else at this time.
Thank you, Steve.
Welcome.
Bye.
Bye. Mm-hmm.
All right,
okay.
Steve, go for it.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, let's see, I've been trying to develop realistic economics since the 1970s, and a large part of it is what are called system dynamics, so showing the economy as an integrated system rather than equilibrium, and bringing in the monetary sector. And that's culminated in the software package I call Minsky after Hyman Minsky. And what it lets me do is model the banking sector and then the financial flows that exist in the banking sector. So I want to just quickly show this, mock up a rapid model of what banking is like using Minsky and show how to use it. I would love to have people in Positive Money do this to model your proposals about positive money, because it is now possible to model quite a sophisticated view of a banking sector. But I'm going to make up a little mock one, a very simple one here. Imagine that it's only firms that take on loans. So I'm going to have loans, and the underscore there means subscript the next character. So that's going to be loans of F for firms, just to make it easy. And then say have reserves. And then I'm going to have firms having a deposit account. And then notice we've got these plus and minus keys here. If I click on the plus key here, I create a new liability. So that's going to be workers' deposit accounts. And then let's have the banking sector equity. So that's set up the arrangement for modelling a monetary system where firms take out loans, firms hire workers, et cetera, and I'll rapidly put it together. Imagine there's $100 billion worth, let's say, of loans initially, and you have 70 billion of that in the firm's deposit account, 10 in the workers' deposit account. That therefore means you have 20 in bank equity. Okay. So that's what Minsky is doing, all this checking to make sure every line you put in accords with assets minus liabilities minus equity equals 0. That's what's going on over here. So to build a simple model, I can have lend to firms, and you type words in here rather than typing in numbers. So I'll type lend lowercase or underscore F, lend to firms. Now Minsky is saying you're currently unbalanced over here. So you have to type something which will balance it. So you've increased the loans. That's because you put money in the firm's bank accounts. Then you pay interest. And there's a number of ways to distribute it. The easiest way is simply to say, well, banks firms just pay interest on the amount of money that's outstanding on their loans. So they pay the interest to the bank, they pay it to the bank's equity account. And I've made a mistake there. And you can see what I've done. I've added to the deposit account and added to the equity account. That's wrong. There has to be a minus. You take money out of your deposit account and pay it to the bank. Thanks, honey. I'm getting some food here. Coconut, cool. Life in Thailand has its benefits. Okay. So that's interest payments, and then you repay the debt. So that's you hand over some money in your firm's bank account to the bank, and the bank says, okay, you've taken the money out, we're going to mark down the amount of money you owe us. And that's another mistake. Minsky has noticed that I haven't got a lowercase here or a subscript, so I've got to type the subscript there. And then there's made you hire workers, so you have wages coming out of here and going into the firms, into the workers' bank accounts. And then workers consume. And then bankers consume. I'm doing this very rapidly. So having done that, I've got a very basic model in terms of financial flows of an economy. And that's the basic starting point of building a Minsky model. And what Minsky has done, and this is likely to scare people, but I'll still show it, it's generated a set of equations called differential equations to show all the flows there. And it's made sure that those equations are consistent. Now, if you wanted to model positive money, okay, then what you bring in, I'll just bring in another godly table here and say, make this the central bank. And if I now take a look at the central bank's table, what's a liability in the banking sector is an asset in another table. Equally, what's an asset over here is a liability. If I click on what liabilities exist and haven't been allocated to any of the group, one of them is reserves. Now I've got reserves turning up there, nothing happening with reserves because I haven't built anything into the model so far. But it's that sort of building of an integrated account going on that gives you an integrated view of the economy. And what you might, for example, have is, say, the fund for private banks, okay, into which the central bank could be putting money that banks then have to lend out over to the private sector. And so you could actually build a model of positive money using that sort of analysis. So, okay, later. But I'm doing a bad demo here. I'm part of it, doing too much work and I'm getting a bit on the tired side here. This is a Sunday after all for me. But I'll show you what goes on.
Working you hard here.
Okay. I'm going to take a look at the firm sector now and just show you how Minsky built an integrated view. So remember I had, in this table here, I had loans to firms as an asset of the banking sector and deposits of firms of the banking sector as a liability of the banking sector. Once you look at it from the firm's point of view, that reverses. So it's assets, the bank account, and its liability are the loans. And Minsky is now bringing all this information across and saying, well, you've got to now complete some of the details here. So here's the firm's equity, and that's minus 30. Consumption by bankers increases equity, so does consumption by workers. Interest payments reduce your equity because you're paying money to the banks, and paying wages to workers reduces your equity. So you're going on and doing all this stuff and you're building a model of an integrated system here. And then to actually make a proper model, a mathematical model of that, you take a copy of the stock variables, which are these ones here, and a copy of the flow variables and relate them to each other. I'll quickly show the simplest, and that is interest payments. So if you want to show what interest payments are, well, you're paying interest on loans. and you pay a rate of interest on loans, and I've typed R lowercase underscore L there. Minsky then brings up a window saying, what is this thing? Well, it's a parameter, and it's interest rate on loans. And let's say it might start at, say, 5%, and I can give it a maximum of 20% and a minimum of 0 and a step size of 0.01. And then to work out what the interest payments are, you multiply the rate of interest by loans, and that tells you how much interest is being paid. So you just type a multiply key on the keyboard, and Minsky will bring that across and wire it up. And now you've defined what interest payments are. And if I hit the calculate or the stop button here, Minsky then works this out initially. And since I started, pardon me, that's grabbed the wrong part of the model. Okay, I started with loans at 100. Interest rate is 5%. That means initial interest payments of $5 million per year, whatever it might be. So you're defining an overall model. It takes a while to define all this stuff, but not long. And then what you have is a model of the financial dynamics of your economy. So you could actually mock up a model, as I've done over here. I'll bring up the completed model. This is a model of how neoclassical economists think the banking sector operates. This is loanable funds. So I've gone through doing all the definitions over here. And what I've got is the neoclassical fiction that banks are intermediaries. So I have a consumer sector that makes loans to an investment sector. And then you have repayment of debt. You pay interest from the investment sector to the consumer sector. You pay a fee to the bank for being an intermediary in the first place. And then I have hiring of workers, purchases of goods and consumption and so on. And with that model, if I simulate it, I get what neoclassicals think, which is a world in which you can ignore lending, because it's possible to change values on parameters while my simulation runs. So what I've got here is the number of years it takes loans to double. The amount of outstanding debts currently is 7 years. The number of years to pay debt to 0 is 9. And if I drastically increase how fast banks lend and slow down how fast people repay money, then I get a huge increase in the debt ratio and nothing happens to GDP. Okay. Then if you go in the opposite direction, notice, by the way, when the debt levels rose, there was a slight drop in the growth rate. This is how your central bank thinks. Now, if I say there's a dramatic slowdown in how fast loans are given and a speed up in how fast people repay the debt, you get a plunge in the debt ratio and nothing much happens to GDP. And that's looking inside the mind of a neoclassical economist, asking, why do you guys ignore the banking sector? Well, I can very rapidly, with Minsky, dive in here to the banking sector's view of the economy and take a look at the consumer sector's view as well and say the mistake you're making is thinking that debt is an asset of the consumer sector. Okay? Because the money that's being lent from the consumer sector to the investment sector can't be shown on the bank's balance sheet over here because it's not an asset or a liability of the banking sector. It's an asset of the consumer sector and a liability of the investment sector. So with Minsky, I can say, well, that's a myth. Let's just get rid of the debt there, delete it, and get rid of the financial operations you allege happen between the consumer sector and the investment sector, and go across to the bank sector and say, let's make room for another asset here. What liabilities haven't yet been allocated as an asset? Debt is one of them. It brings across lending and repayment operations. I now simply need to say, well, interest payments are made to the bank rather than to the consumer sector, and there is no bank fee. Reset the system. I'll go back to start where I did with the rates of lending and repayment I had in the beginning of the simulation of loanable funds. And you end up in a completely different world. I've changed nothing else, but I've now got a world where GDP is growing, the growth rate is positive, and as debt rises, you have an increase in the money supply. And then if you have a decision to lend more rapidly, you get a boost in the growth rate. If repayments slow down, even more of a boost. If you go in the opposite direction and repayment happens more rapidly and lending more slowly, you go into a slump. So that's a very, very fast, I'm sorry, this is not what I do, I give as a lecture, but a very, very fast intro to how you can model a monetary system in Minsky. And I think I'll put on some seminars on my Patreon page and take people through how to do this, to build models overall. But it is not difficult at all to model the monetary system, a monetary economy, using this tool. Whereas I think one of the major reasons why we don't understand the monetary system properly is nobody's built a way of building models of the monetary system before that isn't immensely complicated. And this is quite straightforward to use. So, and it's mainly because we're using what accountants use, double entry bookkeeping. That's just to show the investment sector's view of the economy. So Minsky maintains all this stuff for you, forces you to make things balance with the view of the equity, and then enables you to numerically simulate the system and see what happens when you change various parameters to see how the economy behaves. So I've lost a lot of audience there. No, that's not amazing.
You still got quite a few though.
Mm-hmm.
You got time. I think we got one more question here only. You got time for that?
Yep.
I realize you got your dinner there, so I don't want to keep you too long. It's going to get cold here in a minute.
It's actually starting off cold. It's coconut.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay. I better have a taste of it. I think it's actually baby coconut, which,
ooh.
Yeah. I think that's the end I opened it at. That's pretty straightforward. Just hope I don't wear it when I try opening it.
On camera, being recorded. You better do it tightly. Would you say it's okay for the government to create money and it's okay for banks to create money, but that if there's too much of either one, that's when you get asset bubbles?
Yeah, asset bubbles tend to come out of private sector creating money and government not creating enough. And that's where it's really quite fascinating to take a look at the 1920s. Because in the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge was convinced that running a surplus was a great idea for the government. And for the whole of the 1920s, he ran about a 1% of GDP surplus. And his 1928 State of the Union address said what a brilliant policy this had been, how the economy had boomed, and we could look forward to prosperous days in the future, otherwise known as the Great Depression. Okay? What went wrong was, again, he was ignoring the private sector. As he was running a 1% of GDP surplus every year, the private sector increased its debt level from 50% to 100% of GDP, and a huge part of that actually went into margin debt. I don't have the figures handy because I've changed my database a bit right now. I have to fix it up to show it. But margin debt went from being 1% of GDP in 1920 to 12% of GDP in 1929, and then back down to 1% again with the crash. Now, so people were borrowing money, gambling on rising share prices, thinking they were all, masters of the universe, the great Gatsbys, and it all came tumbling down into the Great Depression. And one reason people were doing that is because as Coolidge was reducing the negative equity of the government by paying its debt down, he was increasing the negative equity of the private non-bank sector. And so private non-bank individuals went to the banks to borrow money, and we had the huge bubble of the 1920s, the roaring 20s. So the real danger is letting private debt do that. So if the government creates too much debt, ironically, what it's likely to mean is too little debt for the private sector, not too much. Because if the government's running that negative equity, then the private non-bank sector is going to be in positive equity. And the pressure we individually feel, I don't like my net worth being negative, isn't there. So one tends to operate in the opposite direction to the other.
We've got a couple of parts to this one. If you don't have Japan's trade surplus, then is there a limit to how much money the state can borrow?
Yeah, and I think that's true. This is where I differ with modern monetary theory quite emphatically. Warren Mosley had an argument over this on a discussion on the web. I've forgotten the actual show, but I was quite stunned by his argument. I just couldn't believe I was anything so silly. But what Warren Mosley has this idea that he says that exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. And I'm actually pretty annoyed with the other professional economists in MMT for not challenging him on that, because it's a whole range of silly arguments about comparative advantage and also about opportunity cost that just, I think, don't make any sense in progressive economics. But to my way of thinking, one of the ways to create money, I mentioned you can create money by banks lending out more than they take back in repayments, by the government spending more than it takes back in tax, and by, again, exporting more than you bring back in imports. That will create money domestically. Now, if you're running a deficit, then you've got to be, if you're running a deficit on your current account, you've got to have a surplus on the capital to balance it. You've got to be selling assets.
You're talking about a trade surplus there.
Yeah, you're running a trade deficit. You're going to have
deficit,
you're running a trade deficit. You're going to have to be issuing bonds to get foreign money. And when you think about it, like banks themselves borrow a lot internationally. Now, why does a New Zealand, I'll take an Australian bank because, as you know, all your New Zealand banks are Australian banks, you poor bastards. Why does an Australian bank borrow in American dollars? Okay. It can't lend American dollars. Why does it borrow in it? Because when it borrows long term, it can put those American dollars on its asset side as an asset, and you show its equity, because its equity involves both its share equity and also its debt equity. Its overall equity position includes long-term debt. So they, therefore, by borrowing, say, $1 billion US dollars, they can put $1 billion US dollars on their equity calculations and lever it up by a factor of 10 and lend $10 billion worth of American dollars, $10 billion American worth of Australian dollars, which might be, say, $15 billion. So that's what they're doing. They're borrowing foreign money to lever up their equity position so they can create more money. Okay. Now, of course, what do? They put that into house bubbles. So we do get this feedback from running a trade deficit, which means you are likely to be issuing bonds internationally. Your banks will issue the bonds initially. If you get in a really bad way, your government will start issuing the bonds, and then you've got the whole Argentina type situation where nobody trusts the money to be repaid, so you get a collapse in your currency and collapses like that. Mind you, I remember vividly remember talking to a member of the Argentine, this is a private conversation, but I can divulge it now, the Argentine embassy in Australia back in the 80s, when Argentina's foreign debt was about 40 billion US. He said he's convinced there's at least 40 billion US in the offshore bank accounts of the Argentine elite.
Dirty pool.
Mm.
Is it true that the state can just create money without this constituting it borrowing money from anybody else?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And again, that is simply because if you run a deficit, the government, you need to have a central bank to make it feasible to do this. All you need is a treasury. Nobody goes and checks your books. Okay? We talk about auditing the Fed. Nobody talks about auditing the Treasury. By definition, the Treasury must be negative equity if it's got any debt at all. Okay?
He says then the danger of this is the possibility that people will lose confidence in the currency effectively. He said that's one of the dangers.
I think you have lose confidence in the currency when an economy is failing to produce enough of goods and services for its own people. That's when you tend to lose confidence. The government does have a capacity to maintain as much negative equity as it's willing to take on. The question then is, what does that do to the real economy in the process? If you do it in an economy that doesn't have sufficient productive capacity, then it will mean a lot of that money will leak into imports, and then you can get caught in what I see as a double bind. That's where I strongly differ with modern monetary theory on the desirability of a trade deficit. I think my international policies would be to try to limit trade deficits and trade surpluses to no more than 2% of GDP, which is what Keynes had as a target back in Bretton Woods, and of course he was overruled by the Americans. And then we went to floating exchange rates, and everybody was convinced that would get rid of trade deficits. Now we have Japan and Germany and China and places like that running trade deficits of 10% of GDP indefinitely. So much for the price system.
Our final question: is it wrong to increase taxes? Should we reduce taxes to zero? Why not? And how is the right level of taxation arrived at?
Well, just like as a government spending creates money, taxation destroys it, takes it out of circulation. So if you have a government spending and not doing any taxing at all, and you look at the scale that governments are right now, then nobody is going to argue that won't cause inflation ultimately, maybe sooner than later, because governments are 30 to 50% of GDP. So the annual spending by a government is of the order of 1/3 to 1/2 the country's GDP every year. Now, if you were creating that much more money, yes, you would cause inflation, or you'd cause an explosion into imports and the current account crisis and so on. So you have to take some of the money out, but it's no longer a question of that taxation financing what government does. It's taking money out of circulation that government's already created. So my focus on taxation is very, very different. I think a lot of the reason people turn right-wing about governments is because it's so damn complicated to do your own tax. You see this large amount of your income going in tax, et cetera, I would rather find ways of taking that money out of circulation that didn't involve income tax. So I'm quite positively, I haven't worked out the mathematics of it, but I'm quite positively disposed towards the idea of a transactions tax. A low level.
Credit parties talking about getting rid of GST and putting a finance.
Not a VAT. No, I don't like VATs.
No.
But for a start, they're supposed to get rid of the black economy. They tend to encourage one instead. You get a lower price if let's not include GST here. Let's not say I was working on your property today. 90% of the cost for you when we both come out ahead. It's a black economy thing. It's complicated, it's cumbersome, and it only affects commodities. It doesn't affect financial transactions.
Yeah, social credit actually eliminates VAT and then replaces it with a lower rate financial transactions tax.
Yeah, I'm quite well disposed towards that. Again, I haven't worked it out carefully, but that's my inclination that it'd be better than income tax. But partly in terms of the political reaction it generates, if nothing else.
Yeah, no one likes paying taxes. Yeah. Okay, well, look, thanks so much for your time, Steve, and really appreciate you coming on all the way from Thailand and helping us understand this a little bit better.
You're welcome. I'm sorry for such a rushed and sort of clumsy presentation, but I'm just a bit too overworked right now, so I didn't put a good one together. But I'll try to do that on my Patreon site at some stage and give an explanation to how to do the modelling and so on. I put some YouTube videos up just recently, by the way, and they're free access on my website. So if you go to the patreon.site and look for the, I've got they're called the Minsky models of modern monetary theory. Check on those videos and you'll see me very slowly building a set of models and you'll get the idea of how you construct a model. And I would like to see somebody in Positive Money build a model of your suggestion for the monetary system.
Okay,
good
fantastic.
talk, Steve.
And
thank you.
Of course, if you'd like to support Steve and the work he does, you can support him on Patreon. Yeah, thanks so much for doing the work. It's important work. We need somebody to be doing it, Steve.
Thanks, mate. And if you can copy the video to me, I'll put it up on my Patreon site as well.
Okay, will do.
Okay, and again, congrats from one country that's COVID-free to another.
Yeah, aren't we lucky, both of us?
Indeed. Okay, bye all.
All right, see ya.